Is and okay, I think do you see, sorry, do you I've not okay, perfect. Right, the recording is on. Um and so I will introduce today's speaker, who we're very happy to have join us for this series. Georgina Sturge is a specialist in statistics and the author of the critically acclaimed Bad Data: How Governments, Politicians, and the Rest of Us Get Misled by Numbers, published in 2022. Her latest book, Some of Us: A History of the UK in Data, published in 2025, is a social history of the UK told through moments when people started to be counted in different ways. From 2018 to 2025, Georgina was a statistical researcher at the House of Commons Library, which is the in-house research service to the UK Parliament, where she authored materials for debates and briefed MPs and their staff. Prior to working at the UK Parliament, she was a quantitative researcher at the Overseas Development Institute. She now works as a research affiliate at the University of Oxford, providing data expertise to its Migration Observatory. She's also a researcher with us here at Maastricht University and a freelance writer. Georgina has been an expert advisor to the UK Office for National Statistics since 2018, and she chairs its Migration Statistics User Forum. In her role as an author, she has appeared on BBC Radio, including as a guest on the statistics programme More or Less, and in UK print publications such as The Times and The Guardian. Her TEDx talk on What's So Dangerous About Bad Data from 2023 is available to watch online. And lastly, she's an alumni of our MPP programme here at UNU-MERIT. So with no further ado, let me hand over to Georgina, whose slides are already available. Georgina, whenever you are ready.
Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Good. I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, thank you for that introduction, which I'm cringing slightly at because I think that's what I wrote and sent to you. So thanks, Talitha. And it's great to be here and to present to all of you some of the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years. So we will crack on if I can get this working. So what's this about? What am I going to talk about today? Well, population data is the theme. What is population data? Where does it come from? And I'm going to talk about the development of how we came about counting people. I'm going to look at migrants and migration specifically in population data because this is a migration audience. And I'm going to pick out some historical migration stories, which I found when I was doing all this data research that I wanted to share with people because I think they're quite fun and interesting. And all of this is going to be about the UK, or pretty much all of it. Although there's some cases where we'll look at other countries, and there's some applicability of all of this to other democratic countries. And then I'll talk a bit about what I've called the negotiation, which is to do with the perils of being counted. So the idea that being included in statistics can be a good thing and at times a bad thing. And lastly, I'll include a little bit of advice, my own, about doing research with population data. So I will just have a quick eye on the time. Right, who am I? We've already kind of been through this, but I'll just go through it again. I'm a data expert, statistician, and a writer. So I was a statistician at the House of Commons Library, which is this beautiful room. And this was at the Houses of Parliament in the UK. I was there from 2018 to 2025, basically part of a team who responded to questions from MPs and their staff about anything to do with data and statistics. And we would also prepare material for debates and anything going on in the chamber. That was a very interesting job, very relevant to my MPP experience. And it also was the inspiration behind my first book, Bad Data, which was about how governments and politicians get misled by numbers. And it was kind of an explanation of where data actually comes from, as well as pointing out the ways in which it can be flawed, sometimes or often without people even realizing it, and how that can lead to problems in public policy. And this was my second book, which, as Talitha mentioned, came out last year, Some of Us. This was a fun one for me to write because I love history, and this was the idea behind it was it's a history of the UK told through moments where we started to count ourselves, and I'll say more about it in just a bit. As mentioned, I'm an MPP alumnus, 2013. That makes me feel pretty old, but we won't dwell on that. And since 2025, I've been back at UM, and oops, to go back one, and my main day-to-day work is actually for the Oxford Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. So this book, Some of Us, it's a social history of the UK, as has been mentioned. It's about people, so that's what's meant by a social history. And it's told through the ways in which people were counted, going back several centuries, and in fact, really more than a millennium. Not that there's much data back then. And the idea for it came from a conversation I had after the first book, Bad Data, where somebody asked me if that was all the bad data, what about the good data? And that got me thinking about this question, what has data done for us? And when I started thinking about it and looking into it, I realized there was a time when data on people just wasn't available. It didn't exist. Statistics hadn't really been invented yet. But we take for granted now that all of this data exists. And what I wanted to find out was how did we get from that point of having no data on populations to having the huge amount that we have now? Was it a smooth process? What was that like? And also what did it do for people to suddenly have all this information out in the public domain that wasn't there before? And my main source was the UK Census. So I'll talk in a minute about censuses and what they really are, but I also looked at other data sources from the UK, like surveys and some population registers. And what I found was that data counting people brought them out of the shadows, sometimes quite literally, because as I mentioned, there was a time when there was just total obscurity in lots of areas, and particularly when it came to marginalized or minority groups. So something that came out quite strongly was the role that data played in increasing the visibility of groups that were not usually in the kind of spheres of power that would have made them visible or important. And migrants were one of those groups, so I'll be talking about them today. But there's also cases like people who were living in poverty, working class people, women, and minorities of different kinds. Counting was a symbolic kind of moment of recognition in lots of cases, and also led to some groups actually having more power because of it. But collecting population data is a negotiation. That's also what I've found through all of this, because the way that people are counted needs to reflect the way in which they see themselves and how they want to be counted. And there were many cases where people rebelled or protested against being counted for precisely that reason, that they weren't being counted in a way that they agreed with or consented to. So population data, my main source, as mentioned, was the UK Census. That started in 1801. That was the first ever UK census. Before that, there were some kind of sporadic databases, lists of people, and they primarily were lists of people to tax, people who had some kind of assets, or lists of people who could be conscripted into the military. So that was almost, well, it was all men. And there were also things like lists of religious dissidents, so people from, yes, different branches of the church that were kind of persecuted. So that was all a bit sporadic until the census came along. There was something earlier called, which is known as the Domesday Book from 1086, which some people think of as a type of census, but it was more a census of assets than people. So famously, so this was a count, it was kind of a stock take by William the Conqueror in England. And famously, there's more records of pigs than women in this Domesday Book. So you couldn't call it a census by any of our kind of current standards. The UK was quite late to the party, doing its first census, proper census in 1801. There were other countries like the US and France who had done, and Nordic countries, they had been doing censuses already for quite some time. I should mention, like, just so we all know what a census is, we're talking about a count of the entire population. So not just a sample survey, but the whole lot. And in the UK, that's been done every 10 years, give or take, since 1801. Not all countries are like this, although most of them, most similar countries to the UK started out doing censuses. Some of them stopped doing it. So the Netherlands is an example of that because they don't really need to do a census because they have a population register. And that is effectively the same as a census, but it's being continually updated. So those records are permanently up to date and on file. And when the government wants data, it can just kind of dip in. The UK doesn't have that, so we've continued to do this 10 yearly census. And as I discovered, it's a really priceless historical record, as well as being a source of data going back a very long way. So 1801, as I mentioned, was the first census, but 1841 was the first kind of proper census because it was the first to include individual level data on people. And I'll just show, sorry if it's a little blurry, but this is how the 1801 census data looked. And what you're looking at here is that one row corresponds to one household. And there's the name of one kind of household reference person, and then the number of males and females and people employed in specific occupations. So that's of limited use if you want to really know about everybody. 1841, it looked like this, and every row was now an individual person. And so for every single person, you had their name, you had age and sex, and occupation was then a free write column. And crucially, you had this, where born. And there were two columns, where born in the country, and then where born, well, so this was for England and Wales, and then where born in Scotland, Ireland, or foreign parts. So that's where we first got data on the migrant population. Well, systematically collected data, that is. And then in 1851, this form became even better and the data collection became even better. So that's where we really got some good detail on where people were born because they could just freely kind of write that in. So migrants appear in the UK census with this first recording of people from foreign parts in 1841. Now, we did have some lists before this. As I mentioned, there were things like lists of people to tax, and foreigners did appear in those quite a lot. And also, as you can imagine, some of people from religious minorities would also have been foreign born, and so they would have appeared in that. There were also some lists of arrivals at ports. And so there were various phases starting already in the kind of 15th century of governments, well, monarchs worrying that there were too many foreigners coming in and deciding they needed to be counted. And then that would happen for a few years, and you'd have these records of people coming in at ports, and then they would kind of forget about it again. So there are some sporadic lists like that. They're of fairly limited use because, as I discovered, a lot of the data is quite lazily recorded. So there's most people who were coming from France were just recorded as Jean Frenchman, and all the people from the Netherlands were called Jan Dutchman. So you can't really use it as a genealogical resource or really know much about these people. But there was some stuff there. And then the 1851 and 1861 censuses were where we got the really good detail. And this was also when the statisticians started to write it up in a nice summary. And so this is a little wordy, but I just want to focus on the last bit. But one of the first kind of bombshells, I suppose, that came from doing all this data collection was to do with not so much the number of people who had migrated into the UK, but the number who had migrated out. Because during the colonial era, the UK was, I mean, possibly the biggest emigrant country in the world, quite probably, or at least one of the big ones. And so this was kind of a realization after they'd counted the people from foreign parts who were in the UK that actually they had to conclude, as they say, there can be no doubt that the number of British subjects abroad who are not counted in the population greatly exceeds the number of foreigners in our tables. So that I thought was quite interesting because part of this whole era of starting to count people that extended beyond just the UK. Every country was starting to do censuses, and so you can see in, for example, the American censuses, so many people from Ireland, which was part of the UK at that time, up until the 1920s. Um, and so you can get a sense, and you can see people who were from England and Wales and Scotland there as well. You can really see that Britain was really an emigration country, at the same time that there were a few people coming in the other direction. But we'll come back to the kind of colonial angle later on. This is from the 1861 census. This is some of the first detailed information that we get. And yeah, there's really very few people from foreign parts, but I think it's quite interesting that you can already see quite a mix, predominantly European, but there are some people from Egypt, there's some people from Mexico, there's people from all over. And so that is a very long time ago now, but there was already quite some diversity in the population. What I want to move on to now is a few stories that came out of this because, yeah, looking at the numbers is one thing, but I think what really brings this all to life is to focus in on some specific cases, and see what the records can tell us. And we're going to start with this one, which is probably completely inscrutable to most people, but I want to focus on a couple of lines. And what we're looking at here is an extract from the 1851 census, which shows a household in Leeds in the north of England. And here are two people who are listed in it. And you probably can't read this, but what it says is William Craft. I don't know if I can use a pointer. Don't know how that works. Done something wrong. Oh well. William Craft, visitor, so that's relation to head of family, male, 26 years old. And then this last bit is the occupation field. And there it says cabinet maker. And then it says something else underlined. And then underneath it is the next person there, Ellen Craft, also a visitor, female, 24, wife of William Craft. And then the same again. And what this says is fugitive slave. And this is a really remarkable census record. This is from 1851. So this was when slavery was still happening in the US. And these people appear in our census in England. And so I looked into this a little bit more, and it's just an amazing story. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these crafts. So Ellen and William Craft had come from a place in Georgia, the state. I believe it's called Macon, but Americans can correct me. And Ellen Craft had been born to a white plantation owner and a mixed race woman who was his slave. So she was herself a slave, and she married William Craft, who was also a slave. But Ellen Craft was very light-skinned to the point where she could pass as being of fully European heritage. And so the Crafts developed this plan to escape from slavery, which was really one of the most audacious that I've ever come across. They spent weeks preparing for their escape by putting together a disguise for Ellen. And the idea was that she was going to pretend to be a white man, and William would pose as her personal slave. And as the time approached for them to make their escape, they suddenly had this realization that they'd probably have to sign in like some visitors' books or whatever when they were taking transport and going to hotels, but neither of them could read or write because they'd never been educated. And so The solution to this was to pretend that Ellen, or this gentleman, had broken her arm. And this is the resulting disguise. So Ellen was dressed up as a white man with this hat on and her arm tied up in a sling so that nobody could get her to sign anything. And there were also some things added to make it look like she/he was generally unwell to kind of deter other passengers from talking to her. So yeah, there was this elaborate disguise. And yeah, I mean, long story short, it worked. So they escaped. They went on this 3-day journey to Philadelphia, going on trains and steamboats and things like that. And then they arrived in Philadelphia, which was a free state. It's a state, right? And but in those times, people from the South could still come and try to hunt down their escaped slaves, even in free states. So they decided to escape further and they came to England. And that's how they ended up in Leeds in 1851 in our census, which is just really quite random and amazing. And they became quite famous because obviously this is an extraordinary story and published this book, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. And they ended up staying in England for the rest of their lives. And this is the census from 1861. And there again, can't really read it probably, but this is the transcript of it. Ellen Craft, there she is, living this time in Hammersmith in London. And look at that, there are 3 children there. And she's still listed as fugitive slave, United States. You'll notice that William Craft is not there. He he was alive, don't worry, but he was in what's now, I think, Benin in Africa, doing some campaigning work there to try and eradicate slavery at the source. So that's the story of the Crafts. This is the next one that I want to show from this era of early evidence of migrants. And so in the 1961 census, you find quite a lot of people from foreign parts, and there's more detail given about where they came from. And at one very unique address, we find at least 20 people who are either migrants or likely of migrant descent. And this is the entry. And it's at this place called Stranger's Home. And this is in Limehouse in East London by the river. And this Stranger's Home was a purpose-built building on the river, which the community had funded to provide shelter to destitute sailors. So in 1861, we can find a lot of people staying here who are from a whole load of different origins. This is the transcript of it, which I think was done by AI. This is from the website where this is all digitized. So I don't think that many of these are right, but I think this first person, Syed, it says he was a nature cook. That's not really a thing. I think that this says native cook, but his origin is India. You've also got Gottlieb Abrahamson, student, I think we'll read that as, from Russia. And then there are people from, this one's not transcribed, but I'm pretty sure it says India. And then you've got various people who are described as Lascars, which was kind of low-paid sailor role, usually for people from South Asia, but I think there are people from East Asia in here as well. And then if you look at the 5th line down, John Johnson, another escaped slave in 1861, which I think was, yeah, during the Civil War in America. So this is just one address where you've got a whole load of people from different origins all staying there. And the stranger's home pops up in various different censuses. It appears later again. I looked at 1881. Most of its lodges were sailors and soldiers from China. They were from Arabia, India, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. And then by 1901, oh, there it is. That's a picture of it from 1870, and then the outside from 1850. 1957. This is, yeah, the same place, but in 1911. You've still got some really interesting characters here. I just zoomed in on this one because I thought this was quite fun. Joseph Mabata, dining room attendant from Africa Zululand, which is part of South Africa. And then this one, Ushikoshi, a ship's fireman from Japan. So you just don't necessarily think that there was this level of diversity and I suppose adventurousness that people would come from so far to be living in London at that time. But the records really showed that there were a lot of people, especially if you hone in on specific places where you would expect to find them. So, what was the effect of all this population data? Well, there was great interest in what was called the strictly foreign element. So, this meant people who were not from the UK and not from any of the UK's colonies. Oh, the lights have come on. And so the statistics lifted the lid on what mobility was like to the UK and also from the UK and its colonies. And it became clear that, like I said, emigration from the UK was really high and that it was higher than immigration into the UK. So these statistics, I don't think I want to dwell on them because of the time, but yeah, basically what they're saying is most of the people who were migrants within the British Empire were from, well, not most, but let's see, natives of the United Kingdom. Yeah, I mean, probably like close to half of migrants in total in the British Empire were people who had come from the UK. So it was really a one-way kind of flow at that time from the UK outwards to other parts of its empire. Now, immigration was obviously relatively low, but it did continue to grow. And there were some negative effects of this visibility of people appearing in statistics. So by 1901, there were around 300,000 strictly foreign people living in the UK, and a lot of them were people from Russia and Eastern Europe even, Germans, Poles, and Italians. And although being counted was a type of recognition and acknowledgement, the effect of it for migrants themselves was probably mostly negative. There was prejudice in particular against the Irish and Jewish people. And the Irish were actually internal migrants within the UK because it was part of the UK at that time. But they attracted a lot of negative stereotyping and prejudice. And the same goes for Jewish migration. So that's attracted a lot of attention and hostility. Now, there's no record of religion in censuses. So the way that they were kind of identifying Jewish people was, I think, predominantly by birthplace and people's names. So this is a map from the time that, like, those show where the synagogues were, the little Star of Davids that are on there, but the coloured kind of streets. This was a map that was actually made at the time of where Jews were in London. And so, yes, on the one hand, visibility, strength in numbers, but maps like this were also clearly meant to kind of be to sort of keep an eye on a population who were on the receiving end of a lot of prejudice and negative stereotyping. And then in 1905, we had the Aliens Act, which was the first immigration control in 70 years. And I think it's fair to say that this came on the back of this huge amount of data collection and just the pinpoint kind of precision of what we knew now about migrants and exactly where they were. And yes, there were probably still far more people from the UK who had emigrated to other parts of the world by that point, but the focus was really at that point on immigration and controlling it. So moving on, I want to talk about this thing that I'm calling the negotiation with population data. So we've covered the ways in which which population data can be disadvantageous simply by drawing attention to people's numbers and their whereabouts. But on the other hand, there is this strength in numbers argument of people being visible, giving them a bit more clout if they want to argue for something. And visibility can also protect. So you see this more nowadays, but just from, yeah, one example from when I was working at Parliament was that when Ukraine was invaded in 2022, there was a lot of people were asking for data on Ukrainians in the UK, and we had just had a census in 2021. So actually, the Office for National Statistics was able to really quickly get that data into a releasable shape and put it out there. So we knew exactly how many Ukrainians there were and where. And that was really useful in planning the program of support for Ukrainians. So planning this whole scheme where they could bring family members over to the UK. So it can be very beneficial to have data if used in the right way. But like I said earlier, counting has to be by consent if you want to live in a democracy, that is. And without consent, you may find that there's protest. So this isn't about migration, but this is one of the most famous examples of protest against being counted. And this was in the 1911 census, where there was a boycott and also a kind of vandalism campaign by the suffragettes who were campaigning for women to vote. And so they did things like this, defacing the census form by writing, "No persons here, only women." And the argument was, if we don't count to you, the government, society, then you don't get to count us. And in doing that, we're disrupting your little counting process. So yeah, that was one of the most famous examples of it. Not necessarily very effective, but it was a very good PR campaign. The other thing to bear in mind is that categorizing people is rarely or perhaps never a neutral act. So for migrants, oh, this is another point. But yeah, this point about categorizing people, there's always a layer of kind of imposing and reducing whenever we're categorizing people. And that's important to bear in mind, especially when looking at historical data. And then when it comes to migrants, you've also got this question of how to record data on race, ethnicity, and religion, because those classifications are really classic ways of othering migrants and their descendants. And that's something which came out really strongly in my research. So I'll give a couple of examples now. They're not entirely migration related because they're more about ethnicity and religion, but it's just to show how people from minority backgrounds can have their dignity removed by either thoughtless or deliberately dehumanizing exercises to count them, and that this can have a lot of impact. So this is perhaps the most stark illustration. In the US, the first census, which I think was in 1790, they, after a long process of deliberation, decided that they would count slaves as 3/5 of a person. So that was after, yeah, a lot of back and forth between the northern states and the southern states about what to basically do about the question of slaves, because the northern states were arguing that they shouldn't be counted at all since they were denied any of the rights of citizenship, kind of suffragette style argument. And the southern states were arguing they should be counted, but it was more to boost their numbers for the sake of greater representation in Congress. So this picture is not from that. It's actually from a much later slave census that was done in 1860, but it illustrates a different point, which is the slaves are all listed there, but they're not given names. The name is always just the name of the slave owner. So these numbers, you're counting the population, but it's equivalent to just counting people as assets if you count them in this kind of way. The British also took regular censuses in the territories that they governed across the British Empire. Now, just before we get into what's on the screen here, there was no recording of ethnicity, race, or religion in UK censuses until 1991. So just kind of let that sink in. The exception was in Northern Ireland/Ireland, where they started recording religion a bit earlier. But the point was there was definitely nothing on ethnicity or race because it was thought of as a bit too taboo to directly ask people that in Britain. It was thought that it was too sensitive. Meanwhile, in the UK colonies and overseas territories, none of this caution was applied at all. So you've got all kinds of classifications, sometimes very offensive ones, being applied to the the native indigenous populations and migrant populations in the colonies. And so this is an example from Sierra Leone, and it also kind of illustrates that there was a lot more effort usually given to accurately enumerating the white population than there was to the migrant or the indigenous population. So in Sierra Leone in 1901, we can see this incredible amount of detail on the white population by nationality. You know, there's one Swedish person, like that would never pass disclosure control now to have such detailed statistics. Meanwhile, the black population, and I apologize for this language, but the largest category there is called liberated Africans and their descendants, natives, children born of strange tribes. Yeah, and then this is from the same census, religion. It illustrates the same point because you've got the all of the kind of Christian population broken down into you've got 30 Presbyterians. I'm not sure what good it does anyone to know that level of detail. And I don't know what Lady Huntington's connection is, but I'm intrigued. But then when it comes to the non-Christian religions, you've got Jews, Mohammedans, and a third of the population is classified as pagan. Sorry, let me go back. Pagan. Yeah, so kind of illustrates there was probably not much effort given in this particular context to finding out what the local religions were called. And yeah, this is not really relevant, I now realize, but this is just about British emigration again. So this is just showing some of the number of immigrants from the UK. Don't know why I put this on the slide, but it does show that emigration from the UK was actually higher in absolute numbers back in the 1880s than it is now, which is quite striking, given that the population was a lot smaller back then. This, I'll just check the time, is from an 1851 census, well, report on the Gold Coast, which is now part of Ghana, the coastal area of Ghana. And this is just telling a story that the population there had refused to be counted in a census, so they couldn't report it. But it's kind of an interesting one because apparently, according to this, they refused to be counted because it says the motive they were erroneously supposing the motive for doing so was for the purpose of giving freedom to their domestic slaves. Now, I don't know how much truth there is to this anecdote, whether that's really the reason they refused to be counted. One suspects there were probably other reasons as well, but this is kind of a unique case that I came across as well and thought was quite interesting. Now, oh dear, I'm running out of time here. I'm going to try and get through this. Fear of it being enumerated can be justified. I'll just bring up a couple of examples. In the UK, there is precedent for people being targeted through data. So during World War One and World War Two, the government basically just took census data and used it to create lists of Germans, Austrians, and Italians and other people who were classified as suspect in some way and sent them to internment camps. And most of those people ended up on the Isle of Man, which is not that bad, but some were actually interned in the Australian outback for however many years. So there is reason to fear being on a list, even in the UK. And then a Dutch example, the Netherlands was obviously occupied during the Second World War by the Nazis. And there was a very kind of audacious bombing that was carried out by the British RAF of this building in The Hague, because that's where they were storing all of the population records. So the Netherlands already had a population register at that time, and it had all of this information about exactly who lived where. and that was being used to persecute Jews and people and other minorities and people who were targets of the Nazi occupation. So they bombed it so that this couldn't continue. Um, and that just shows kind of the importance of data as, yeah, I mean, it's a resource in times of war for good and for bad. And it can be kind of like one of these resources that, yeah, you can turn against you as well. Takeaways from all of this. So historical population data is a gold mine for migration research, in my opinion. There's a lot of stuff in there about migrants and population change, and also from a kind of historiographical perspective, it tells you a lot about the way in which people were counted over time. That tells you a lot about how they were seen, and how they were classified, and whether they kind of had any part in that classification themselves. Statistics are not neutral, like I said, and data collection is also not neutral. Hopefully, I've made that point with some quite extreme examples here. Categorizing and labeling is always kind of a work in progress. So, like I said, in the UK, we didn't even start collecting ethnicity data until 1991. And so that is also still kind of a work in progress. The categories are changing all the time. And what's important is that there's a successful negotiation between the counter and the counted. And countries in general, democratic countries, are much better at doing that nowadays, but it is still a work in progress. Lastly, some tips for people who want to do this type of research. So I only focus on the UK, so I don't know what it's like trying to find census reports for other countries. But in the UK, all of the census records from 1841 to 1921 are now digitized on these two websites. You do have to pay, but you can just pay like for 1 month, or however long your research is. Censuses also had summary reports, which is where you'll find nice statistical tables, and some of those are available online, but actually most are in hard copy only. So I was quite lucky that we had all of them in the House of Commons library, but you can also find them in the National Archives and the British Library, and there may be copies elsewhere as well. If you want to do this type of research, my advice would be to just browse through these records, look for stories, look for the unusual. Historical data, I think it can tell you about people as a mass in a way that other historical records can't. And I actually think statistics can tell you a story that doesn't feature in a lot of records from the time because they tend to be about important or exceptional people. And statistics, by contrast, kind of tell you about the people as a mass. In other words, real, ordinary people and what they were doing. But it's in the detail where you find the real kind of spice of life. And so I'd encourage you to snoop around in historical records if you get the chance and look for your ancestors, maybe look for famous people, look for migrants, because yeah, that's where the interesting stories are. Okay, I'll wrap it there because then we've still got a bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Georgina, for that fascinating presentation, which I'm sure leaves many of us wanting to read your books. I'll open the floor immediately to questions. Do you prefer to take a few at a time, maybe to maximize the time available?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay. Melissa already has a question. Valeska has a question. Okay, Melissa, please start us off.
Sure, yeah. So Georgina, thanks so
We
much
don't hear you.
for you don't hear me? Do
I
you
can
hear
hear
me?
you.
Yes? Okay, great. Okay, so thanks so much for giving this talk. It's something that I personally was also really interested in. So thanks for humoring us and giving the talk. Um, so I'm interested in the decision to actually start collecting data on ethnicity and race in the 1990s in the UK. So do you know why that came about? So why the decision to actually start collecting this data? And is there anything that you think there is currently in this census that, let's say in the UK, that shouldn't be there?
And just to follow up, Valeska, would you like to add your question, and then Georgina can answer as she sees fit?
Um, yes, perfect. Yeah, thank you, Georgina, for this. I loved it. I loved every single bit that you showed in the stories you tell. Fantastic stuff. And I don't think you gave us the worst examples. I was reminded of a master thesis of a friend 20 years ago who looked at the public administration of the genocide in Rwanda and how, census data was very detailed. And I mean, this is why now in Rwanda you don't have in the passports any link to ethnicity and so on. So I think we do need to be very wary. And as you may know, I look at unintended consequences of certain interventions in Africa specifically. And I wonder what you think about the fact that actually Objective One of the Global Compact on Migration is to collect and utilize accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based policy. And under that, you have things like statistical capacities of countries and data sharing and all of these kind of things that, from an African perspective, is perhaps problematic in many ways. So I just wanted to hear your take on
Great, thanks both of you for the questions, and glad you liked the presentation. Yeah, starting with Melissa's question. So yes, if you dip into Some of Us, you will discover there's a whole chapter on when we started recording ethnicity and race in the 1990s. And actually, they already started talking about including that as a census question in the 1970s, because there was concern. Well, going back a little further, there was a wave of migration after the Second World War to the UK, which is now referred to as the Windrush migration, of people coming from the Caribbean and also from South Asia. And so there was kind of a like changing face of migration, if you want to put it that way. There were visibly more people who were not white and had come from other parts of the world. So there was talk kind of about, is there sufficient integration, etc. And already, yeah, in the 1970s, there was significant talk about whether there was greater levels of disadvantage among particularly the Caribbean population in the UK. And as part of those discussions, they started to say, well, we don't have any data on this, so we can't even say who we're even talking about. They could use data on country of birth, but because so many white British people had also come back from the colonies during decolonization, it was really hard to tell if somebody born in Barbados was black or white, to put it bluntly. So that's when they started talking about it. But it took a very long time for them to introduce a question because there was just real squeamishness about asking directly, which is kind of ironic considering how they recorded people in the colonial censuses. And there's one particular test they picked a part of North London called Haringey to test some questions about ethnicity because it was a very diverse area. And they had enormous trouble testing these questions because people were very suspicious about why they were being asked. And, rightly so, given some of the examples of people being kind of rounded up from lists. But yeah, there was huge suspicion, and there was also a really difficult negotiation between how people wanted to be recorded and what the statisticians were willing to give them. And a key sticking point was people wanting to be able to put Black British, and the statisticians, for whatever reason, having a problem with that. And this went on until the 1990s when they kind of caved into the reality that this was how people were self-describing. And then that came into the census. But it was, yeah, a long process, and yeah, a lot of kind of institutional squeamishness, for want of a better word. Your second question is really tricky. What shouldn't be in the census? I mean, they are continuously they're actually now deciding what should be in the 2031 census, and they have decided to drop a couple of things. And I think one of them is something to do with, is your house heated? What type of central heating does your house have now? Because it's just kind of redundant, like everybody has central heating, more or less. Apart from that, yeah, I do feel the census is probably a bit long on the whole, but I wouldn't really know what to drop. I think maybe you could make some things optional and then do a bit more imputation. But in the UK, yeah, the UK statistics are in a period of kind of transformation at the moment, because there was actually an idea to stop doing censuses altogether and to replace them with just administrative statistics. That's now been shelved, and we are doing a census again. But I think it kind of still remains the long-term ambition. Like, you don't have to necessarily wait 10 years to find out some of this information. You can just do targeted surveys, or you can use very good administrative records and that sort of thing. Sorry, that didn't answer the question at all, but I don't know.
No, it's no problem. It was more in case there was something that you obviously thought shouldn't be there, for ethical purposes. But if there's not something obvious, that's also fine. That's good, I guess.
No, I don't think so. If anything, I think there's some things just to be added in,
Mm,
but more out of just curiosity. Like, yeah, I think it would be really interesting to see people self-describe social class. This is a very particularly British thing,
mhm.
but I think that would be interesting. And then Valeska, yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't really know about the Rwanda case, but yeah. I came across other examples of where they used census data. I think Serbia was another one where they had really good population records, and then it was just kind of a gift to people who wanted to hunt down particular ethnic groups. So yeah, good question. Is it always desirable? And should we always push for more data on, well, everybody and on migrants in particular? Yeah, I think we need to be very careful about this because, yeah, it's just this kind of, it's going to give you this visibility of people, but that can be a good and a bad thing depending on who it's visible to and what their motivations are. But I think I'd probably err on the side of more data is generally better because without it, there's just so much more room for misinformation.
So actually, can I just abuse my
Please.
position and jump in again? Because that just made me think of something else. Because right now we're talking about like government official collected data, right? But nowadays, one of the big issues is all of the data that's being collected on us all the time by tech companies,
Hmm.
where a lot of that we don't consent to, or we sort of consent to in certain ways, and then how that's used and sold and things like that. And, I guess. I guess my question is more, should we be more concerned about this data than government collected data?
I think yes,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah. And that's kind of what I see as like the next big frontier of data gathering. That, like you said, there's actually probably more data and much more sensitive and personal data being
Hmm.
held by private companies. And we've got absolutely no oversight, like very little legal oversight of where that data goes, who it's sold to. And as individuals, we've got no ability to hold these companies to account because,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, you basically can't opt out of everything. You're going to end up on some kind of digital database of a private
Hmm.
company, whether you like it or not. So that's the big one. And I think this is also a question for development because this is a bit of an ongoing back and forth, how much to involve private sector actors in kind of in development activities and particularly in infrastructure provision. So if we're talking about getting people online and whether AI and digital can be really useful for basically accelerating development, yeah, valid question to consider. But you've also got to think about these are companies that are going to be collecting a lot of data at the same time and holding a lot of data. And where's that data going to be held? Is it going to be in country or is it going to be in a data storage facility somewhere else that's completely out of jurisdiction? Yeah. Um, yeah.
And just to throw one last tricky question at you that is not easy to answer in the remaining minute that we have, but Philip also put a message in the chat,
Oh.
which you've somewhat addressed already. He asks, do you think that there is a point at which not collecting certain data, or particularly migration-related data, is more ethical than collecting it, even if that means giving up potentially valuable insights? So you already said that you would, yeah, that of course there's this tension, and you would generally err on the side of more data, but maybe there are particular kinds of data that you would avoid collecting at this point.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think it probably depends a bit on this issue of kind of consent and self defining. So, who's deciding in what manner data is collected? Who's deciding on the categories? Because if we're talking about things like, yeah, data on migrants and it's got things about ethnicity and origin and stuff like that, yeah, like what's the purpose of that? It's not just necessarily useful to have in its own right. But if it's kind of collected with the agreement of the community in question, then that could potentially be a good thing. But yeah, I suppose like, yeah, the purpose of it is probably what matters. Is it actually going to give you some useful information from a public policy perspective, or are you just collecting it for the sake of it? If the latter, then yeah, probably be a bit more cautious as to whether it's worthwhile.
Yeah, and of course, it also depends on if we could think about public policy for what public policies, right? So now a lot of actually data also collected not only by the public sector, but by the private sector is also being used by ICE in the US to also track down irregular migrants too, right? So, and that's officially, a public policy goal um, of the government. Whether or not we think that that's correct or ethical, it's definitely something that's being used.
Yeah,
Yeah,
once.
once data is out there,
Mhm.
you haven't really got control over who
Mhm.
then gets access to it. I mean, theoretically, in a democracy, there should be accountability, and if it's being shared outside of its parameters, then the courts or whoever should be able to put a stop to that. But in reality, we know that these processes take a very long time.
Mhm.
And yeah, meanwhile, the government could be handing your data to people who it said that it wouldn't, and there's not a great deal that we can do about it.
Which also, just to wrap up, relates to the comment that Valentina made in the chat about the changing political context and the way that you can't easily predict, as Melissa says, what public policy objectives there will be in the future and who will be in power.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this
this
is
is
one.
one of the reasons why people object to data gathering in general and to censuses. And in the UK, we have a debate at the moment about digital ID, so ID cards. This is a debate that's been resurfacing for a while, and people object to that. A lot of the time, they say it's because the government now might be very kind of well intended with this data, but we don't know in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or 15 what government might be in power and what they might decide to do with it. At least this is what people say.
Well, with that, I think we will end the session. Georgina, thank you so much for giving this presentation and engaging us in your research and in the very detailed and fascinating stories that you've shared, but also in these broader questions that you've raised and that we've discussed very briefly now. Yeah. The recording may go onto YouTube shortly, and thank you to everybody for joining us, and see you at the next migration seminar, which focuses on return migration from Germany to Turkey.
Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Melissa, can I have you for 2 minutes?
Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah, I can stay on for a second. Just can
Yeah.
you so stop the recording, whoever's
Yeah.
recording?
Oh, sorry.